Hey, welcome everybody. I'm sharing screen so I can't see everyone as they join, but it's great to have you join the session. Welcome to the event, Advancing Indigenous and Diverse Knowledge Systems in Global Assessments. We have quite a packed agenda today, so I want to quickly go through some housekeeping notes. We have interpretation in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and the main session will be held in English. Please write in the chat, introduce yourselves, your name, organization, the city that you're joining from. Because we have such a large number of people joining, we'd like to request that everyone stay on mute, and unless prompted by one of the panelists during the Q&A, we'd be really grateful for that. But continue to write your reactions in the chat section and use the reaction button to react to any comments that you hear. I think that's everything from me. And without further discussion, I'm going to hand over to Obed, who will give us a quick run of show, a quick agenda, and introduce the speakers. Obed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. We are thrilled to have you join us in this discussion today. On behalf of the IIED, a warm welcome, and we hope that you find the discussion fruitful. And as we continue the discussion around engaging for the greater good of the work that we do in advancing inclusivity and global assessment processes to ensure that we have representation from across the board. So it's really a pleasure to welcome you, such a diverse group of participants that we have today. Looking through the registrations, I see that we have Indigenous knowledge holders, we have researchers, authors, practitioners, policymakers, and colleagues from all walks of life and regions and institutions. So a warm welcome. So this is a timely and important discussion for us. And as you know, as climate and biodiversity crises intensify, global environmental assessments play an important role in shaping policy, funding priorities, and broader public understanding of environmental change. But these processes also raise fundamental questions. Whose knowledge is recognized in these assessments? Whose perspectives shape how environmental problems are framed? And under what conditions are different knowledge systems invited to engage? So these are not only technical questions, but rather questions that also talk about ethics, legitimacy, relationships, and power. At IIED, we see value in creating spaces like the one we have today, where we get to engage in meaningful discussions, because meaningful change does not happen through technical recommendations alone. It also happens through dialogue, reflection, and the willingness to challenge established ways of working. Our work as IIED has long focused on questions of equity, participation, and locally grounded knowledge in environmental decision making. And increasingly, we see the need to support conversations that move beyond simply asking whether Indigenous and diverse knowledge systems are being included, but more of asking how engagement happens, on whose terms, and what institutional changes are needed to make the engagement more meaningful. And because inclusion alone is not enough, if we do not, if engagement remains extractive, tokenistic, or shaped entirely by norms of dominant institutions. So meaningful and ethical engagement with Indigenous and diverse knowledge systems requires more than just participation. It requires respect for distinct ways of knowing, different governance systems, and the relationships and responsibilities that knowledge is rooted in. That's why today's conversation matters. And this webinar gives us an opportunity not only to reflect on lessons from previous assessment processes, which include various IPCC assessments and IPBES assessments, but also to think practically about what needs to change as we move forward. We will hear findings from recent studies that have been conducted by our teams, reflections from speakers with direct experience of these processes, and hopefully create space for honest and constructive dialogue about both the challenges but also the opportunities ahead. So I hope today encourages us to reflect on all of us and the work that we do, particularly those that are working with institutions that shape assessment processes. And because meaningful change begins with listening, but it also must lead to action. So a warm welcome once again, and thank you for joining us. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Nora, even as we appreciate and acknowledge our panel of distinguished speakers that we'll be hearing from shortly and leading our conversations today. So over to you, Nora.
Thank you, Obed. A warm welcome to everyone today. As Siobhan and Obed were saying, so happy to have you all in the room. We're going to start today off with a bit of a Mentimeter. I'm sure many of you have used Mentimeter in the past. If you haven't, it's very simple to use. On the screen, you will see a QR code and a website link, as well as a code. You can use any three of these to enter Mentimeter. The QR code is the easiest. So you just give it a scan and it will bring you to the Mentimeter where it'll ask you a first question. And the question should be, where are you joining from today? So I'll give everyone a moment for that QR code. And then I will now share my screen, Siobhan, to start going over the responses, if that's okay. Thank you. So just bear with me as I share my screen and we can go over some of these. Siobhan, can you give me a heads up if you can see my screen?
We can see it. Thank
Great.
you. There you go. It's in the presentation mode now.
Yes, thanks. Okay, great. So we're seeing lots of people joining us, lots of people from London. I myself am in London, in the UK, France, Mexico. We've got Bangkok, Portugal, Paris, Nairobi, Turkey, Switzerland, Denmark, really across the world, Brazil, Cardiff, Massachusetts, Cape Town, South Africa, Toronto, Canada, Wilderness, I think also in South Africa, Durban, Trinidad and Tobago, really across the world we have, and we've got still some more responses coming in. So it's really great to see so many people from so many different areas. Portugal, India, big contingent from India and Canada. That's great to see. Germany as well, Indonesia, Rome, York, England, Stockholm. Fantastic. Perfect. USA, Chile now, and Sweden. Fantastic. Okay, really getting across the world. We're going to move on to the next question, just by virtue of time. But yeah, great to see so many people. I'm going to move us over now. And our next question is really to gauge what matters to people in the audience today. I will be speaking slowly so that our interpreters can hear the questions as well. So why does engaging Indigenous and diverse knowledge systems in global assessments matter to you? If we can keep them short and snappy, that would be fantastic. Epistemic justice, Indigenous rights. My Spanish is not great and my French either, so I won't try to read those. If I do, I apologize for any mistakes. Increasing inclusivity, Indigenous rights. Yep. Justice coming through very, very clearly here. Yeah, really great to see regenerative futures, unique knowledge, Indigenous rights, equity, justice, and rights really coming through strongly. Evidence, inclusivity, better solutions, learning, environmental stewardship, definitely. Decolonization, custodian of most lands, impact, sustainability. Yeah, some really great things. Lots of overlaps as well that we're seeing between these various points. Diverse worldviews, Indigenous leadership, reparations, impact, socio-environmental justice. So really seeing learning, wisdom, justice, Indigenous rights, inclusion, equity, respect, and sustainability coming through here, which is yeah, great to see. I'll give this a couple of more moments for more responses to come through. Great. Yeah, I mean, center stage here is equity, justice, and inclusivity. So I wouldn't have expected anything less. Fabulous. We're going to just move quickly to the next question, and by virtue of time, so apologies if no one was able to put their response. And the last one, or the second to last one, is which sector do you belong to? We'd like to see who's joining us here today. We've got Indigenous peoples and representatives, research and academia, government and multilateral organizations, donor and philanthropy, civil society, NGO, and other. Lots of researchers and academics joining us today, and lots of civil society as well. Great. Yeah, so, oh, we've got a donor and philanthropy. Thank you for being here today. Indigenous peoples and representatives, we've got some there. Government and multilateral. Great. So across the board, people representing each of these 6 sectors, which is fantastic. That gives diversity of opinions and means that this speaks to a diversity of people. Great. And last but not least, what is the biggest barrier to meaningful and ethical engagement with Indigenous knowledge systems in global assessments? We're just going to do a quick pie chart here and see some responses coming in. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to go very quickly on this one. We've got dominance of Euro-Western evidence bases, institutional process barriers, funding and participation barriers, political resistance, tokenistic engagement, and other. And already we have dominance of Euro-Western evidence bases coming through. Karen and Rosario, I'm sure that speaks to much of your research. If you want to come in, please feel free. I'll just give it another 10 seconds. Yeah, really getting dominance of Euro-Western evidence bases coming through, and then institutional and process barriers. Perfect. Okay. I hope this is useful to gauge for everyone at the beginning. I'll stop sharing now. Thank you for everyone who's participated, and it will stay open for you to continue giving us your views. I'll just stop sharing now and hand over to Karen and Rosario. Oh.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. We are very happy to present the IIED policy briefing with all of you, which I co-author with Karen Wong Pérez and Nora Nisi. We will introduce the papers and some of its findings. But the idea is invite all of you to read it. So at the end of the presentation, you will find a QR code for downloading it. To begin, next slide, please. I would like to talk a little bit about the motivation of this work. And at the heart of this paper is the recognition of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, and particularly the right to self-determination. This means that Indigenous people should be meaningfully included in the intergovernmental processes that directly affect them. And also an important motivation is the growing recognition that current responses to climate change are still not enough, and that institutions such as the IPCC face major challenges in producing evidence and assessment that are truly relevant for effective decision making. Also, increasingly, the IPCC has been called upon to broaden its evidence base and engage more meaningfully with Indigenous knowledge systems and other diverse knowledge systems. And Indigenous knowledge systems are grounded in generations of observing, understanding, and responding to environmental changes. So they offer critical and specific insights that can strengthen the relevance, legitimacy, and effectiveness of climate and environmental assessment and responses. However, what we have observed, and particularly up to the IPCC 6 assessment cycle, AR6, is that these knowledges still remain marginal within IPCC assessment and are often included in fragmented or even extractive ways. And at the same time, we also know that there are important experiences that can help inform a different path forward. So there are authors within these processes who have been pushing for change for many years. There are also many indigenous-led initiatives, and there are also intergovernmental processes and experiences which have developed more advanced approaches for engaging indigenous knowledge systems. The next, please. The next slide. Yes, thank you. So what does this paper do? We draw on interviews with 9 IPCC and IPBES authors. Some of them are here as speakers and participants who have direct experience working with indigenous knowledge systems in global assessments. We focus on their personal experiences and reflections from inside these institutions, and through these interviews, the paper maps the structural, procedural, and epistemic barriers that continue to limit meaningful engagement with indigenous knowledge systems. The paper also identifies practices that have worked, and from there, we reflect on possible pathways and implications for AR7 and future assessment cycles. The next slide, please. Many of the barriers that we discuss have been widely discussed in the literature and by indigenous scholars and organizations, so I will only mention them briefly here. But one we can clearly say is that these challenges go far beyond individual goodwill. They are deeply embedded in the institutional structures and logics that shape the assessment bodies. And the first issue concerns evidence and epistemology, as most of you recognize now with the Mentimeter. The IPCC still relies primarily on peer-reviewed scientific literature and does not yet fully recognize other knowledge systems as equally valid within its institutional framework. And a second issue is that indigenous peoples are often treated primarily as providers of data, rather than as holders of knowledge systems with their own methods, values, and internal logics or validation systems. At the same time, open data policies usually conflict with indigenous peoples' rights and sovereignty over their knowledge. There are also important institutional and resource barriers. Funding remains a key one. Language support for processes that are mainly conducted in English is another one. And there is very little space for the slower, relationship-based forms of engagement needed to build trust and meaningful collaboration. And finally, although AR7 represents important progress on this, the number of indigenous CLAs, coordinating lead authors and lead authors, is still very small. And as a result, decisions about framing and content are still shaped largely by non-indigenous authors and also non-indigenous institutions. So with that, I hand over to my colleague Karen, who will speak about the more hopeful and enabling dimensions that emerge from our research. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rosa. And as Rosa just provided the bridge for this, alongside with the persistent challenges, we also ask during our interviews some of the approaches that are already working and that have been identified as enabling conditions. And first, to the question about what counts as legitimate credible evidence, that talk about that, the epistemic dimension, one clear insight that came from the interviews is the importance of institutional frameworks that explicitly recognize the coexistence of indigenous and diverse knowledge systems. And you will see here in the left and center two examples of this. IPBES is perhaps the most developed example through its conceptual framework on the left and its multi-evidence based approach on the center that recognize indigenous, local, and scientific knowledge systems as distinct and legitimate in their own right, with their own methods and forms of validation. And within the IPCC, there are also important precedents in this direction. For example, on the right side of the slide, you will see the special an image that appeared in the special reports on the ocean and cryosphere. That show that indigenous knowledges can complement scientific evidence, challenge it, or independently contribute to assessment evidence. So these precedents are valuable because they provide practical reference points for co-chairs and coordinating lead authors and chapter teams to make the case for engaging. Next slide, please. We also heard the important role that leadership and champions have had in previous assessments. Progress has often depended on co-chairs, coordinating lead authors, and chapter teams that are already willing and passionate to actively create a space for more meaningful engagement with indigenous knowledge systems. And at the same time, one of the broader lessons from the interviews is that progress becomes more even across chapters when it is supported by institutional frameworks, structures, rather than relying only on individual commitment. So the authors also pointed to the importance of dedicated institutional participation mechanisms. IPBES, for example, offers some key insights through its task force on indigenous and local knowledge. They also use liaison groups and structured dialogues with indigenous representatives. And these mechanisms enable cross-chapter coordination, collaborative outputs, and they also create continuity across assessment cycles, build institutional memory, and create clearer and more formal pathways for participation and influence. Apart from that, all authors also highlighted the importance of broadening the forms through which knowledge can enter the assessments. For example, the possibility of have open calls that accept contributions in multiple formats, including audio recordings, visual materials, and that broadens what counts as evidence. Also important, the mention of relational practices or practices that aim to restore or build relationships and trust. And some successful strategies for this include field visits, workshops, participation in indigenous organizations meetings in their own context, and knowledge co-production processes. And importantly to mention that these more intercultural and relationship-based approaches were also important in shifting mindsets. And next slide, please. I think it's the last one. Yes. Yeah, so taken together, these experiences from IPBES and IPCC authors offer practical lessons for how the IPCC can move towards more equitable knowledge practices. And the briefing mentioned a few of these practices that I will mention very quickly. First is early engagement. Authors were very clear that when indigenous participation begins at the scoping stage, indigenous knowledges are far more likely to shape the framing of the assessment throughout, rather than appearing only in isolated boxes or case studies. Second, the findings suggest that while individual commitment can lead to important progress, sustaining that progress requires stronger institutional framework, support, memory, and continuity. So the paper, in line with other calls, proposes creating a permanent funded body that can connect regions, understand both IPCC procedures and indigenous governance systems, and maintain long-term relationships with indigenous organizations and knowledge holders. Third, rethinking evidence and governance. This is not only about broadening what counts as evidence, but as mentioned earlier, ensuring indigenous knowledge are engaged on terms defined by indigenous peoples themselves. And possible pathways include co-produced knowledge, Compedia, collaborative publications, and governance mechanisms led by indigenous peoples to determine how knowledge is documented and used while respecting data sovereignty. And finally, on navigating political dynamics, this brings us back to where we began. This issue is not simply how indigenous knowledge systems can improve assessments, but rather how global assessments engage with indigenous peoples and their knowledges in ways that are equitable, ethical, and rights-based. And there is no technical challenge here. It is shaped by wider political tensions, including ongoing colonial legacies, struggles for territorial rights, sovereignty, and broader geopolitical dynamics. And we need to be aware that authors working in R7 will continue to navigate these geopolitical and power dynamics and pressures. Progress will therefore require multiple pathways implemented by multiple actors in coordinated collective action, acting in allyship to move towards more equitable knowledge practices. And last slide, please. I will close with saying that perhaps the key message from the briefing is that there are already many important experiences to build on from both IPBES and IPCC. And the question is how to move from these lessons to more coordinated action. If you'd like to explore the findings in more detail, the briefing is available through the QR code. And with that, I'll hand over to Graeme Reed from the Assembly of First Nations, who will welcome our distinguished panel. Thank you.
Yeah, so miigwech, Karen and Rosa for providing such a thoughtful overview of the research that both of you conducted, and I'm excited to be able to talk about it with our illustrious panel, Anin Bojo, Graeme Reed, Anishinaabeg, Saudono, Jabon, Anishinaabe, and Dao. It's a real honor to join this virtual circle with all of you. I'm joining from unceded and surrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe Aki, what's currently known as Ottawa, and hold different hats, but include my role at the Assembly of First Nations. And so I'd like to maybe request the screen close and invite my panelists, all exceptional scholars and participants in both IPBES and IPCC, Sandra Diaz, Deborah McGregor, Pasang Sherpa, and Janita Gurung. All of which are quite quite renowned in their own right. And so what we're going to do in this panel discussion is do 3 quick rounds of discussion. The first round will just be an introductory question, then a specific question based on all of your collective experiences. And then hopefully, if we have time, looking forward, how do we operationalize the experiences as well as those 4 areas that Karen had just described. And so perhaps I can go to you, Professor Diaz, and just invite you to introduce yourself. And on that last point, briefly share what keeps you hopeful in these turbulent times.
Okay, thank you. I'm honored to be here. I'm Sandra Diaz. I come from ecology, so quantitative natural sciences. I work and live in Cordoba, Argentina, and I was one of the co-chairs of the IPBES Global Assessment for Biodiversity. What gives me hope is that despite all the horrific things we see around us every day, I still think people want to do things. I still find people coming up with very creative ideas, and I still think people are prepared to work, even when objectively there's little hope. Thank you.
Great point. Pasang, why don't I invite you to introduce yourself and share?
Tashtale, I'm Pasang Yangjee Sherpa. I'm a Sherpa from Nepal, northeast Khumbu region. And currently, I live in Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam Peoples Territory, also known as Vancouver, where UBC sits, University of British Columbia. So for me, this question of hope, when I get asked about this question, I often say that there is no option but to keep things optimistic and be optimistic. And so the question of what keeps me hopeful is quite uneasy. But when I look at my daughter's eyes and when I'm talking to my daughter, I cannot help but feel hopeful.
Awesome. Very much for that, Pasang. Janita, why don't I invite you to introduce yourself and add?
Hello, I'm Janita. I just want to say hi to Pasang. We're from the same country, and like she said, I'm a Gurung from Nepal. I was also trained as an ecologist and an environmental scientist, but my work has led me to really work with communities, especially women, and to work on community-led approaches to biodiversity conservation. So I'm very passionate about that work. And when it comes to hope, I was really going downhill in hope, but then last year, I gained a lot of hope from the youth of my country, the Gen Z movement. And now we have all these young leaders, and the oldest minister in my country is younger than me, so I'm really hopeful. And then also in a personal way, like Pasang said, I'm very hopeful because of my daughter. She's 16 years old, and the choices and the things she tells me about sustainable living. I never told her anything of that, but then, she gives me a lot of hope. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Janina. And Deb, want to bring you into the conversation.
Yes. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, or middle of the night, wherever people are zooming in from. Yeah, so Deb McGregor. I am actually sitting in my community of Whitefish River First Nation right now. So I'm actually happy to be at home and seeing the changes. Mosquitoes aren't too bad yet. So yeah, my involvement in assessments have been varied from specific to national assessments in Canada to IPCC as a contributing and then lead author. So lots of different experiences and opinions on how these go and how well they deal with really Indigenous people in order to access Indigenous knowledge. I guess you could say more of a social scientist, although all of my degrees are different. I just kind of do wherever my path takes me. And what keeps me hopeful, I think, to me, the main thing is because of the nature of the work that I do with Indigenous knowledge systems is, and I work a lot with our own stories, is they are very hopeful, even in the face of disaster. There's always a way, there's always solutions, like not the solution, but pathways to come out of these situations that are usually human caused and often relying on the natural world to assist us through. So to me, those stories are very instructive to how we can navigate and deal with the challenges that we're facing right now. And I think, and I'll just speak for myself, there's lots of Indigenous peoples here on this panel and participants, as well as we've also had to face our annihilation, and here we are having this conversation. So I think there's something to learn from Indigenous peoples about how you face what we're facing and then how to move through that and still be who you are. So thank you for this opportunity. Miigwech.
Awesome. Miigwech, Deb. Really, really thoughtful responses from all of you, and very grateful that you would share what keeps you going. Perhaps we can move a little bit to our tailored questions, and I'll come back to you, Sandra. You've worked for a long time at the intersection of biodiversity science, policy, and plural knowledge systems. I wonder if you could describe the biggest institutional barrier that you see, especially around valuing Indigenous knowledge systems, and what would transformative change look like?
Okay. I really like in the presentation, it was said that we need to go beyond the good intentions, right? There's no question that historically and even today, there is this dominance, this arrogance of Western science knowledge over other ways of knowing. In some institutions, this has been somehow overcome. Like, for example, IPBES was born with the mandate of taking into account multiple knowledge systems, including prominently that of Indigenous people. Yeah, Indigenous people's rights and ways of doing things and knowledge. And so the intention was there. And I can tell you that within the ecological community, or at least some portion of the ecological community, the good intentions, the sincere intentions have been there for quite a long time. But then, even the intentions are changing. You face the problem of the dominance ossified in the structures. And then you can see that even if the intentions are the best, the structures don't let you make progress. So, for example, in IPBES, all the plenaries, the indigenous peoples and nations have the right to speak, but they don't have a vote, right? Only the countries can vote. Then in the nomination process for different chapters, countries nominate people, and very, very, very rarely, maybe now it's a little bit more common, but in the beginning, finding an indigenous scholar nominated by the country was really a rarity. There was no way. And I don't know what you know, but something like 80% of the authors have to come from country nominations. Then you can do as many workshops as you want, but there's no budget for the workshops, and there's no budget for translation, right? So in practice, there are very, very few workshops people can really have to sit together and look at each other's eyes and work out things. That's just one small sample of examples of the ossified structures that go against us, even if the intentions are the best. And of course, one obstacle that I think is getting less and less and less of an obstacle was trust, right? You know, from the Western side of things, abandoning our patronizing views, and from the indigenous peoples' side, abandoning the understandable initial distrust, right, and defensive position. So those were the obstacles with which we struggled. We made, I would say, considerable progress, but I think we have a very long way to go.
Thanks, Sandra. And any thoughts on where to go, just briefly?
Yeah, I would say we have to find a way. I don't know exactly how, but we need to make it happen. Maybe, you know, donors, maybe, you know, illuminated governments, I don't know, to fund the funding and implement a long organic series of workshops, of schools of co-learning between the different ways of knowing, just sitting together with time on concrete questions and listening to each other and learning each other's methods, learning to weave to this knowledge to construct something new. If I had the money and the power, that's the first thing I would try to do.
Fantastic. Yeah, lots of I think like little nuggets. And what I want to do is I'll go around the rest of our circle and then come back to like thinking concretely, what are those things that we can do collectively? But I really appreciate what you shared, Sandra. And it also speaks to what was shared earlier about like the power differential, but also the sincerity of sitting and working with one another. Pasang, I'm gonna bring you in next and would invite you just to speak a little bit about your experience within the IPCC, about engaging ethically with Indigenous knowledge, and in your perspective, what would ethical, non-extractive, and rights-based engagement look like for authors, for the institution, for assessment processes more broadly?
Thank you so much for that question. A few things. So before I start talking about answering your question directly, I think I should say that for the 6th assessment report, I was a contributing author. And I wrote about my reflections on how I was invited, but my full participation was not possible. And this happens to me a lot, just as an independent, at that time, independent researcher without university affiliation, but as an Indigenous woman, scholar from so-called Global South, right? And so I think the tokenistic representation and inclusion is first and like foremost what I think about when I think about IPCC participation. But following that, I came to UBC, where I then, working with my colleague, Dr. Ritodi Chakravarti and Kristen Gillis, we started to look at the sixth assessment report, because based on our experiences, both Ritodi and I, a man, upper caste from India, had a very different experience working as a contributing author to the sixth assessment report. And so what we decided to do is, with Kristen Gillis, we started looking at the sixth assessment report to see what actual Indigenous content looked like. And that is, again, a project that was never funded. I applied for funding, but that was that was something people or the reviewers said, or anyways, for whatever reason, it got rejected for funding, right? But we still continued the work, but because we believed that it was important to really accurately represent what Indigenous content inclusion in the IPCC assessment report looks like. And so after years of looking at the actual report, which is like 13,000 pages and over 80,000 references cited in the working group 1, 2, and 3 reports, what we found out was not surprising. And I talk about sixth assessment report because sixth assessment report was considered to be one of the best in terms of including Indigenous content. But only 1% of the total references were actually less than 1% of the total references of 80,000 plus had Indigenous content. And also, like what you, Graeme, and Rosa, your work showed, working group 2 was where most of the Indigenous content was, and working group 1 was the physical science basis working group had the least. And so what that experience of just looking at different working group reports and how the Indigenous content is included helped me to think about 3 specific things, coming back to your question. First is definitely what Dr. Sandra Diaz mentioned was with the participation mechanism and the voting. So basically the institutional structure within which we're operating or within which the IPCC operates. The ultimate voting and the say is with the governments. And even when we're looking to include more Indigenous authors, the country becomes the basis of including or excluding or ensuring equitable participation. But when we look at Indigenous issues or Indigenous leadership and Indigenous scholarship, what we see is that if we're using country as the basis of trying to figure out equitable representation in the IPCC assessment reports, that is not helpful. So one of the key things I realized based on looking at the content in the IPCC AR6 is that most of the most useful, helpful content came from North America and not necessarily from Nepal or other countries that are represented in the report. And it's not because we don't have great work in other Indigenous parts of the world, but a lot of the good work and strong work was coming out of North America. And so what that makes me really highlight, what I think we need to highlight is sometimes, the country representation and the country quota actually does not help when it comes to Indigenous, meaningful representation of Indigenous authors and reviewers. And so I think that so the global North, global South distinction and the country representation, I think, should be rethought institutionally. And which also leads me to a somewhat pessimistic view where if IPCC is mostly, if the governments have the ultimate authority, then what what are we doing here, and what what are we trying to do here? I think that's the question for all of us to grapple with. And in the interest of time, I'll just say the two other points briefly. One is the meaningful engagement, which is going back to the tokenistic representation and the power dynamics that Sandra already mentioned. But the third thing I will say is the state of the field in terms of like what kind of research is actually being produced to be cited in these kinds of assessment reports, right? And so even in that less than 1% of the total references that we looked at, most of it is coming, most of it has indigenous content, but these are extractive and exploitative. So for example, the Himalayas is a very good case study here. The Himalayan region, like to be even more specific, just taking Khumbu, where Mount Everest is, where I'm from. Khumbu has the climate change research from that region is just like so much research. But most of it is, and then there's another systematic review a student of mine did, which showed that the Sherpas and the local people are just not even included. And so if that is the kind of knowledge base that IPCC assessment report is going to draw upon, and we're talking about a very heavily studied community, heavily studied region, where the local people or indigenous people, and Sherpas are not even represented as indigenous peoples in this scientific literature, let alone like included, you know. And so if that's the kind of knowledge base we're dealing with, what can we expect from regional and international and global reports? And so these are the kinds of like practical, serious, concrete things I think we need to be thinking about and continue to work. I don't know.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's all.
Awesome. Sorry, Pasang. I think that was really, really exceptional. And it just makes me think about even the sessions that we convened that like differentiates the production of knowledge. And I think what you've described here is a really important characterization of that continues to exclude actively Indigenous peoples, and then also the synthesis of that knowledge within these big multilateral assessments. And so I think all of that is important when considering the depth of these contributions. I wonder if I could just move to Janita, and then we'll come back to like how to action all of these pieces. And Janita, as you mentioned, you're heavily involved within IPBES. In the chat, there's been a couple references on the leadership role that IPBES has played, and so I wonder, drawing on that experience, if you could share a bit of your sorry, two questions. One, what were some of the main experiences that should inform how the IPCC thinks about meaningful engagement? What were some of the challenges that you potentially faced? And then how could we address those moving forward? So 3 questions.
Thank you, Graeme. So for me, it was my first IPBES experience. And I just remember the first authors meeting, there was a session on engaging with Indigenous knowledge. So for me, that was such a, like, I thought it was the norm. So I was very surprised to hear that IPCC does not have it. But everything that Karen shared earlier and Sandra said, so with IPBES, I just felt there was a lot of inclusion on Indigenous knowledge. There was also investment. So Sandra talked about investment. It costs money to work with Indigenous peoples. So there was, like Sandra said, there was a lot of exchange. People were taken to places to learn about Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous systems. So I thought, I didn't go to any of those, but my chapter members did. So I think in a way, the system was there. And I'm very happy I was part of that system. So there was a lot of homework done before we got there, right? But I think for me as an author, And I just want to dwell on what Pasang is saying as well. So I am an Indigenous person. It didn't mean that I knew a lot about Indigenous systems, because I was raised with a Western education system. So, and then when we look at a lot of literature on Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous systems, it's done by people from the West. And then you think about why. Well, first of all, of course, my parents wanted me to learn Western style of knowledge systems, right? So we were very happy to go and study in the US or India or wherever it was. But then also to think about the opportunities that people have in terms of like doing research costs money, and so there's a lot of educational grants and research grants to people in the West to come and do research in our countries. So of course they will come. So they will come, outsiders. They will have all the knowledge systems, all the knowledge. They will produce all those papers. They become professors, and then the people who they did research on, of course, we're still living under poverty. So I think there's that lack of opportunities, lack of importance. And I guess in a way, it's also reflecting on systemic barriers in terms of us being the knowledge holders and also us being the authors of this knowledge. So I think at the base, that kind of system needs to change, and that kind of opportunities needs to be provided. And I just want to say that my own experience while at IPBES, we were looking for Indigenous authors to include in our chapter, and a lot of them were the recommendations we were provided were from North America, Australia. In fact, there were a lot from there, and it's quite unusual for two of us to be from Nepal in a plenary right now, because that is not the case. It's usually very few people who can be recommended for authorship from, I don't want to say Global South because I can't talk about the Global South, but at least from South Asia. So I think that kind of imbalance is also there. So that's it for me now, Graeme.
Yeah, fantastic. And yeah, I think all of these are really important linkages of just the reality of that supremacy of Euro-Western knowledge systems and the challenge that it pervades all aspects of these processes. And so really appreciate that. It also just speaks to like the importance of clarifying how these spaces are in fact deeply political. And I think we sometimes avoid the tendency to discuss them as political, but there are lots of different forces that impact that, and I really appreciate what you shared there. Deb, I'm gonna go to you, and I wonder, thinking about how we engage with these relational and experiential approaches, and I think you described one in your introduction. Are there examples that you can point to where that shifted understandings and processes? And do you have any recommendations on how to support that kind of relational and ethical work?
I think so for how diverse knowledge systems are being framed in co-production of knowledge, which I think the others have also kind of touched on in different ways. What I've noticed in also reviewing the previous reports, well, basically assessment 6 and also the special report, the 1 point, what I'll do, we'll just call the 1.5 report, is how Indigenous knowledge is addressed. And probably the thing that sort of jumped right at me right away was the the disembodiment of Indigenous knowledge from Indigenous people. So if you're going to talk about Indigenous knowledge, then you have to talk about, we're talking about Indigenous people. And when you do that, you're talking about rights, you're talking about governance, you're talking about Indigenous peoples as actors, legitimate and credible actors in these processes, because a lot of the times, in my view, what you're doing is you're trying to counter a narrative. We're just hapless victims, because that's been, this research that Pasang already talked about. Like people you're working with the existing body of knowledge, and a lot of it is look at these victims, and it's true. I say it is true, but it's not the only thing that's true. So I found in my experiences is trying to say that is true, but we have other roles to play in all of this than just we're just victims that other people studied, and that's kind of the body of work that mostly exists, right? And because we're not often asking the questions that's going to generate the knowledge that we can use in these processes. I'm probably kind of going off topic, but that was one thing that struck me. And in my own experience as a lead author, and there's two of us with the cities report, Caroline notices is on the webinar as well, is really we're not the only ones writing about Indigenous people in the assessments. That's the other thing. So people may not know how to recognize not great research or interpret it in a way that where like some literature I know, and I'll read what people say and I'm like, that's actually not what that literature says. Anyway, so that's why we need really good peer reviewers too to keep that also keep that in check. So I think when in talking about Indigenous knowledge, in my mind, it automatically triggers rights. It automatically triggers Indigenous peoples we also govern and we also make decisions. And a lot of these are geared towards very particular people making decisions. But in my mind, I'm thinking we also make decisions. And to me, what I often see missing is how do you actually support Indigenous people's participation? Others have talked about that, and I agree, like what's been said. But you're also trying to support the production of actual Indigenous knowledge as well. What does that actually require? So what does the financing look like? What does the support for Indigenous stewardship look like? Whatever that looks like around the world, because otherwise we don't have knowledge to contribute to diverse knowledge systems or to these assessment processes, because colonization hasn't gone away, and Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, and their knowledges are still being threatened in many places. The other comments, hopefully I'm kind of answering the question, is I just have these scribbles everywhere. The questions are really good, by the way, and I really appreciate the panelists' responses to theirs, and being far more disciplined than I am. I found with Assessment Report 6, when I was asked to be a contributing author, it was very different. So with the hardcore scientists, they didn't even know how to ask me the right questions. They were just told, you should really find an Indigenous person who maybe does some stuff on water, and they'll just write something on traditional knowledge. And they had and I like, could you just give me a bit more direction here? They really didn't know how to even ask me the right questions. They just knew they had to do this thing, right? So there's a big gap there. The North American chapter, so that one, that was very, like, we had to do that in like 3 weeks, but the people that were convened to write that section, it really what it was a lot of social and cultural capital on behalf of the Indigenous authors. They're all Indigenous authors. We all kind of knew each other because we write about this kind of stuff in North America. But so the IPCC benefited from all this other work that we do with each other. So I just call it social cultural capital, because we can say, oh, who can do this on short order? Who can do this in the next? Who knows this to be able to write this content in a really short period of time? Another one, I have no idea what happened to anything I contributed. I don't know where it went. So it's very different, even in the same assessment. So it's really uneven across the board. So probably even with the current assessment, people's experiences in their different chapters varies quite a bit, because it's not there isn't an ethic around how this really, and a practice. The ethics, I think, are starting to be developed, but the actual practice of it is not there. So hopefully I kind of answered that question. But to me, to think about how knowledge should be as part of these processes, those are fairly well developed in Indigenous research fields. So that's like the OCAP principles, part of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and FPIC. It's also the CARE principles. And if people, I'm just throwing out these acronyms, if people want to write it in the chat what those actually mean. So these processes are part of like a lot of Indigenous research or people who want to work ethically with Indigenous people. So these kind of already exist. Like there's, in my opinion, not a lot of excuse to not engage with these processes to ensure that Indigenous knowledges are represented appropriately. But to answer the second part of the question, where I have seen Indigenous knowledge, kind of in my experience, where you're actually looking at a co-production, it's usually mapping. When you look at a map that's led or where Indigenous people are designing and co-producing it for their purposes. Like in Canada, that might be part of land use and occupancy for Aboriginal title claims or treaties, negotiating treaties and that kind of thing. You have knowledge that you would not get from just science. Like they're missing so much there. Indigenous peoples want the tools of science. We're not rejecting science. I found in my career, as soon as I talk about Indigenous knowledge, the scientists go up and say, you must be rejecting science. I'm like, why would I do a scientific assessment if I'm rejecting science? That's not what I'm doing here. So, and we want that science too, because we're decision makers and we want to make the best decisions for our communities too. So mapping to me was one of the easiest ways where you can see that, where there's no way like what's produced in some of the really good maps is possible without Indigenous people and our knowledge informing kind of what that looks like. And then you actually have like a physical kind of product that comes out of it. I talked way too much. Anyway, hopefully this was helpful and much appreciative of these questions. And I hope I answered your question, Graeme. I got too excited there.
No, that was awesome, Deb. And as usual, just so thoughtful. I mean, I think one point that always sticks out in the many years of conversation that we've had is like Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems exists first for Indigenous peoples. And often when we're talking about these assessment processes, like the intention is, it's like this new novel thing, but it's actually like you've described, these systems of knowledge over thousands and thousands of years. And part of the reality is that revitalization is part of decolonization. Okay, I want to ask kind of one forward-looking question to all of you. And then ideally, if there are questions that are coming up, we can try to see if there is time. A lot of you talked about challenges and opportunities and experiences. I wonder if you could just think about one, maybe two practical steps that you would propose to improve the ethical and equitable engagement with Indigenous knowledge systems, as well as diverse knowledge systems. I think we had some messages in the chat about even the role of social sciences. And as you described, Deb, there are multi-decades of research practices that would invite more thoughtful research practices, all of that in future assessments. And so, Sandra, perhaps I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Pasang, Janita, and Deb.
Well, trying to be brief, there are many practical steps we could think of. One is this kind of a school for co-production that I proposed some minutes ago. One really key point, it looks like a very academic one, but in intergovernmental assessments is a crucial point. And I think all my colleagues somehow have touched upon, is what is considered acceptable evidence to support an intergovernmental report, to support a consensus conclusion that could be put to the summary for policymakers and get it endorsed by the countries. The rule now says that it has, it was changing, at least in IPBES, it was changing. First of all, it was very, very hard, anything that is published in the peer review literature between 2 days, right? That was it. And nothing that it wasn't there was considered acceptable evidence. Then criteria were sort of relaxed, and now a lot of gray evidence, reports that haven't been published, et cetera, are acceptable. And in trying to deal with the interweaving with indigenous and Western knowledge in the workshops I mentioned, we did the kind of dialogues we came up with, we in IPBES just came up with some improvised way in the form of reports, reports with a proper ISBN number, so we could cite that report, right? Because it had to have a physical published existence. Now, if you talk about other ways of knowledge that often don't have a published existence, sometimes even it's not, it's against the spirit of that knowledge to have it, in the public domain. On the other hand, the intergovernmental reports demand that these things are verifiable in writing in the public domain, then we have a problem, right? So we need to sit together with lots of time and discuss what could be acceptable evidence for everyone involved. So it looks like very, very logistic, but I think that's at the core of intergovernmental assessments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sandra. Pasang?
I think just I'm going to highlight a few things. First is just this experience at this time, right? So there's a lot of resources now, and which previous assessment cycles for IPCC or maybe for IPBES, I don't have much experience with IPBES, so I'll speak only of the IPCC. So compared to previous assessment cycles, I think this assessment cycle, there's a lot of discussions, a lot of platforms like this, and a lot of things that have come out. And conveniently, one of the reports that Graeme and Rosa, who's hosting this conversation, one of the hosts of the conversation today, we recently produced a report on how to actually do this, recommendations for ethical and equitable engagements of Indigenous knowledge systems in the IPCC. And we have another one that's coming out of the for addressing the UNFCCC. But in any case, the point is there is a lot of resource now, and I think that is those are the places and reports and venues I would direct people to. But to me personally, as a researcher, I think it's important on the one hand, to be raising the issues and kind of advocating for greater Indigenous inclusion, and also meaningful and ethical and equitable engagements of Indigenous knowledge systems. But at the same time, I think it's also, at least in the Sherpa case, I find it very important to produce the kind of knowledge, the science that we need as like you said, Graeme, right? And also Deb mentioned earlier. So the Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge systems, these are for our peoples. And so what kinds of science that our people need? And so right now I'm invested in answering questions that are pressing for our people. And when I'm thinking about Indigenous science coming out of our region, I'm thinking about not just like a rejection. Actually, I don't think we can survive in a world where we can reject one form of science to choose another. We actually, if you're living close to glaciers in the high Himalayas, you absolutely need the kind of Western science that provides certain kind of knowledge, but also you need ancestral wisdom. We also need moral, like understanding of living meaningfully in that space, but also the Indigenous science that have been passed down from generations of experimenting and evidence collecting. And so all of this is important for us to understand what is happening to the place we call home, and also how to live there and continue to live there for generations to come, right? And so I think the question then for me moving forward is not just the continual advocacy for greater representation, but also building that knowledge base that will hopefully actually change how we think about Indigenous science and how do we engage it in a meaningful way. And instead of trying to include extractive and exploitative ways of doing science.
Awesome. Thanks, Pasang. Janita?
In terms of practical steps, I would say 3. One is to IPBES to please continue and perhaps even improve what we're doing. I am very much in favor of the experience that I had. The second practical step is when we ask for recommendations of Indigenous authors, to maybe increase the membership of authors in that list from again, perhaps the global south, and more importantly from South Asia, so that when we ask for potential authors, then we can have reference to authors beyond Europe or Australia. Sorry, not Europe, North America, Australia. And then number 3 is in terms of opportunities. So right now, the funding landscape is dramatically decreasing, but then I know there's a lot of research funds available in the north, and then there needs to be a lot of engagement with them to get access to resources. But I think in terms of research funding, opportunities for researchers from the Global South, if there could be opportunities for them to be able to publish, but then again, it's now refers. So these are practical steps, but then in terms of long-term systemic changes, it's again, how do we view Indigenous knowledge? Do we always view them as great literature? How can we, like what Sandra and Pasang are saying right now, how can we make them more included in these assessments? So that's going to be a longer step, longer discussions. But definitely the first 3 short-term practical steps, I hope, are much more achievable.
Yeah, thanks, Janita. And a lot there that are important, kind of practical ways in which that we can continue to improve. Alongside Sandra's point about acceptable evidence, it's also, I think, criteria for authors as well. And we know that there are many discussions about whether it's an appropriate consideration to require graduate, like a PhD of some kind. And when we're trying to engage with these other knowledge systems, is that the most important way? Maybe Deb, I'll invite you to add any additional pieces, and then I'll try to pick some questions up for all of you.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree with the panelists. I think there's like short, medium, and kind of long term. And one, I would like to see like Indigenous-led research co-producing or whatever to generate that knowledge that we can then rely on. Because in my opinion, people weren't really asking the right questions 10 or 20 years ago to generate the work that we actually need to address the questions that we're being faced with. My other view on the matter is that Indigenous knowledge already exists. We just haven't figured out how to mobilize it into these kind of processes. Like it's already there, but then how do you kind of mobilize it to for these processes to be credible? Like gray literature, I suppose, is acceptable. I've been using it because I'm trying to get like the voice of Indigenous people in there because I'm like one person. I can't represent everyone on the planet. And I think in the short term, and I'll just speak briefly to, and Carol can chime in because she's on the webinar, is we're trying to develop, because again, we're not the only people writing about Indigenous knowledge in these assessments. There is too few of us. It's not possible. And that's a really heavy burden to just like, you do this. It's like, I don't even know what that term is, let alone research it and write about it and then assess it. It's not my expertise, right? So, is trying to provide guidance to them. Do you know what Indigenous knowledge is? How do you recognize when you're assessing work that's actually was ethical? Like how do you and probably one of this question came up also was who I'm reading it in the chat too, who are Indigenous people. Well, I'm not in the business of defining that, like what UNDRIP, it's like up to the people to define that, but it's a real issue in a number of countries and states. But fortunately, Graeme pointed to me to this resource as I was grappling with it, is the UN Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples addresses that. You have to recognize there's regional differences. It's not the same everywhere, even if you can say that, but so who are Indigenous peoples is often like one of the big questions, because I have co-authors who just say there's no Indigenous peoples here. I go, but I met an Indigenous person from there and they're pretty sure they're Indigenous. But anyway, so you're dealing with that in these processes. The other part of it is being able to distinguish, again, these regional differences when you're looking at the evidence or the research or the literature is confusing Indigenous knowledge with different places around the world write about this differently. In North America, we don't.
Sorry,
Like
Deb.
it's Indigenous knowledge. Sorry, I have
We
to
just
stop.
no, we lost you there. You said
Oh,
confusing Indigenous knowledge, and then we
with
lost you.
local knowledge. So
Okay.
some literature puts them together. But when you're only writing about one, you need to be able to, like, how do you then assess that? Carol's kind of figured that out. Like we're trying to help the other authors do a better job. So that's like the immediate short term thing. And then how do you make sure that that's even across the chapters, or in the case of Assessment Report 7, across all kinds of chapters? It's going to be a challenge. And like in North America, we don't write about it that way. It's Indigenous knowledge. I couldn't even tell you who local knowledge would be. I have no idea who that would be, how I would do that. But in other countries, Latin and South America, they do it all the time, or in the Pacific Islands. And so I'm trying to figure out Indigenous knowledge within that, and also local knowledge within that. And how do you even assess that, or even kind of know the difference? So we're finding for the immediate thing is you're trying to help yourself do these properly with respect, but also help your co-authors who don't know how to do these, so that at least the work is going to be the best we can do and the best representation for that moment in time until we move along further. So hopefully that was helpful. So I think there's very short term because I'm in the moment, and then there's long term, like I really wish people did research in this area, then I could cite it. But hopefully we get there, in years coming, and how we train students. I will stop. I know we're running out of time. And apologies to translators for talking so fast. I was really trying to control myself to speak slower so that translation can happen respectfully.
No, that's awesome, Deb, and lots of really important points there, and I think just the important nuance that is recognized within engaging that, and it speaks also to like how are we appropriately ensuring representation as you described, Janita. Okay, there are a couple of questions. I'm gonna try to like parse through them to ask you. Okay, I have one question about, and we've talked about this a little bit, but like how to translate Indigenous knowledge systems in a way that can be used or understood in policy and practice. There's a lot more of description around what that means, but I think a lot of what you've described are like the translation of that knowledge into something. And so I wonder if you have any responses to that specifically, and I'll just go around the circle if anything comes up tangibly for folks, or give me a signal if you can respond. Yeah, go ahead, Deb, and then Pasang.
Yeah, in my experience, even when people want to, they want to be respectful, they want to include it, they just don't know how. They don't. And I think our challenge is how do you take very abstract kind of ideas, like I want to do this, to how do you actually do it? And I think that leadership has to actually come from Indigenous people, because we have to do it all the time. Like we're doing it all the time. For what that should look like, from very abstract kind of theoretical ideas, like we want to do this, and it's even maybe there in writing, but it's not happening in an actionable kind of way. And of course, there needs to be support to make that happen. We can't say Indigenous people should be climate leaders and then there's no support to actually make that happen. Anyway, I'll stop and I'm keen to hear what others have to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Deb. Sandra?
To me, the challenge is not so much the policy translation. To me, is encapsulating the consensus knowledge. Remember, assessments have to be a consensus of the authors, right? And if there is no consensus, you have to explain why is that we cannot agree. So we offer the policymakers the evidence and why we don't agree. Once the authors have been able to express what is the finding or what is the agreement and what is disagreement in a clear way, then deriving policy from that is usually easy. When I say easy, it's easy to come up with a policy recommendation. Now, of course, making that policy recommendation happen in the real world is a question of power, right? But we are not here there. But to me, again, the challenge is how you co-produce this clear, distilled message that does reflect the consensus between the indigenous and the non-indigenous knowledge about one particular topic. I'm thinking, for example, of biodiversity management, right? How you come up with a distilled insight that can then be translated into policy. For me, the only way is, again, just getting into the training of weaving evidence together. I think none of us has enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Janita and Pasang, anything to add? Yeah, go ahead, Janita.
Can I say that from my own experience, for policymakers in my country to include Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practices means giving way to power, having to lose power. And I think it's a huge challenge for us to overcome. I don't have an answer to it. It's persistence, providing evidence, but then again, what kind of evidence? Is it science-based evidence? I mean, it's so challenging that it's still a long way for us to go. Yeah, I'd like to stop there. Pasang, if you want to add there.
It is very challenging. Go ahead, Pasang.
Yeah, I hope I understood the question correctly. But I will say, like Deb, I think it has to, ideally, it would be Indigenous peoples doing that translation, right? And the words that came to me were like, a lot of Indigenous scholars are already doing a lot of the translations. And I think a lot of Indigenous scholars, practitioners, thought leaders have been doing this for a long time. And I think it's a reminder for all of us to learn from what they've already been doing and kind of build on that. And the common ways people have done is like being very creative, but also doing it thoughtfully, and being very informed about what you're talking about. And I think for me, when I'm thinking about how to translate Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems into policymaking or science spaces is by learning from how other Indigenous thought leaders have done and learning from the best practices from them. But being very like educating yourself and being informed and to speak about to do the things that are that make sense to your people and to your community. I think that's what I would say.
Fantastic. I think that's probably the place where we want to stop. And so perhaps I can invite kind of a virtual clap for everybody. Really appreciate all of the incredible contributions that you all shared. want to highlight the work that Rosa and Karen presented with the IIED briefing, as well as the leadership of Pasang and the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge within the IPCC. And yeah, really look forward to translating all of this work into meaningful changes within global assessments. And so there, perhaps I'll turn it over to you, Dilys, to close us in a good way.
Great, many thanks, Graeme. And yeah, thanks so much to the panelists for really inspiring discussion and also some really great ideas on practical next steps that we could take. So I think hopefully we'll find a chance to distill some of these ideas. We've got the recording, we've got all the notes in the chat, and think through, what these mean and come up with some kind of synthesis of all these ideas and suggestions, as well as the discussion today, because it's been really, really valuable. So yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Dilys Roe. I work with Karen at IIED. I've been involved with IPBES, but also have been involved in other global assessments that have been thinking about how to engage Indigenous and also local knowledge within IUCN, within the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So it's something that's going on in multiple different places, and everybody seems to be struggling with the same issues. And I was really struck with some of the comments that were made about, even when there are good intentions to do this, and it's absolutely there and embedded in some of these processes, some of the structural barriers are just there, and I think somebody used the term, they're ossified in the structures that we see in these institutions. So ranging from really what seemingly like really simple things like paying for translation and paying for people to get to meetings, down to the much more complex and politically contested issue about what counts as usable evidence that can be cited in reports. And I think it was interesting that in the Menti, that came out as the top structural barrier and something that we clearly need to pay more attention to. It's great to hear that things are progressing, at least in IPBES, that it's no longer just peer-reviewed literature. There is opportunity to include other literature, and I think that's something that needs to be extended more widely. But I was really struck by the comments as well that it's, quite often Indigenous knowledge isn't documented, it's not written down, so it's not even a question of whether you can get it in the grey literature. It's how do we actually view that knowledge in the first place in order to reflect it in these assessments? And how do we actually invest in continuing to build that Indigenous and local knowledge in order that it can be better reflected? So there's so much more to it than just extending beyond peer-reviewed literature, that we really need to try and get to grips with. I really like the idea that came up in the chat of some kind of like online platform for collecting information, exchanges, reporting, etc., etc. And I think that's something that would be interesting to explore further. So we'd be really keen to follow up on that and look at what might be possible there. But I just wanted to end with just some thoughts on the very first Menti that Nora showed about, why it's important to do this in the first place. And it was really interesting, I think, that there were both sort of ethical arguments, but also pragmatic arguments put forward. So from an ethical side, it is about rights, justice, inclusion, decoloniality, etc., etc. But also just from a purely pragmatic perspective, embracing a more diverse set of knowledge systems actually results in more learning, better outcomes, better solutions, and more innovation. So even if you don't believe in the principles of rights and justice and equity, there's still really solid reasons for going down this route and for supporting the kind of progress that we need to make. So we're out of time, but I really wanted to say that we really hope that this will be the start of a conversation, and we are really keen to follow up. I hope everybody was able to capture the QR code for the briefing paper that Rosario and Karen presented at the beginning, because their emails are on there, and please do follow up with ideas, including for this online platform or other ways that we can take this debate forward by contacting them by email, and we'll be back in touch with you. And also just to say that obviously the workshop report from the IPCC Reading workshop on engaging with diverse knowledge systems will be out soon. And we're really keen to follow up on the recommendations, well, to see what the recommendations are from that, but then to collectively explore how we can follow up on those recommendations. So we really look forward to re-engaging with this group once we have that and continuing to take this discussion forward. So thanks again very much to everybody. Thanks for Graeme for facilitating a really brilliant panel discussion. Thanks to the panelists for your engagement and for really insightful ideas and reflections, and some of your experiences have just been absolutely amazing. And thanks for Rosario, Nora and Karen for producing the briefing paper and pulling this webinar together. Thanks very much, everyone.